So these are my quick out of the theater reactions to the Matt Reeves's The Batman. So I just saw the film, so these are my non-spoiler thoughts. I thought the film was very good at first, and then as it went on, it became more average. And when you have a 3-hour long movie, going from good to average for 3 hours is a lot to ask of anyone. And I think the vast majority of people who've seen this movie, or the people who will continue to see this movie, they might like it, but I think most people are going to leave the theater kind of exhausted. And I think few people will say this is their favorite Batman film. That being said, it's worth seeing. What we have here is a very fragile Batman. I've never seen Batman so fragile. If anything, I would say this Batman feels like a cross between a typical Batman depiction and a very vulnerable Peter Parker. This feels like the Peter Parker Batman. And that is so cool. I would say that goes the same for Catwoman. Riddler is like the alternative to that, where Riddler, rather than feeling super crazy like the Jim Carrey Riddler, contrasting Batman's like stoicism, this Riddler actually feels like less naive and more capable than Batman. And that's actually something they play around with in the movie, especially near the end. And that's really cool to have that character sort of flipped. That's an interesting dynamic, and it makes him seem a lot more threatening. That being said, the Riddler is more of a catalyst for the greater conflict in the movie. And for a movie that has such a fragile, unstable Batman in the form of Robert Pattinson, a Batman who feels less confident than ever in a world with, like, in a Gotham that has more crime than ever. The conflict feels like it just doesn't shake the foundation of Batman. When everything's laid out, and this is a mystery, so when everything's laid out in the third act and you really realize what they're fighting against, it becomes very evident that this movie isn't going to leave a significant impact on you outside of the characters themselves. And that's how I felt. I felt like we got good characters. Kind of similar to Batman Begins, we have very strong characters who may be in even better movies down the line. But if this movie was trying to have a super naive Batman versus a Dark Knight level threat, it didn't get there. This is more like a super naive Batman versus more of a typical like Iron Man threat. That could be really negative depending on what kind of person you are. But hopefully the next movie fixes this. But I'm going to go into some spoiler talk right now because I want to get more specific about my critique. So this is spoiler warning. There's going to be a few spoilers for Daredevil Season 3 in this. So if you haven't seen that or you don't want to know what happens, I'd click out now. But yeah, that's my review. I thought it was decent. Hopefully the next one's better. But it's exhausting. It's 3 hours. And it has strong characters. Anyways, to get more into specifics about what I loved about this Batman, like his fragility. When the movie first starts, we see that this Batman doesn't have this super meticulous Batcave. He isn't the best fighter. He can get easily swamped. And his detective skills can always provide clarity to a situation, but they can never prevent a crime from occurring. He feels very much like an experienced detective, but not this superhero detective that Batman is typically depicted as, or he will later become. Probably my favorite scene in the movie is when Batman has to lead Catwoman through the Penguin's nightclub, which is an underground mafia nightclub where criminals hang out. And he needs her to go through the nightclub with contacts that are cameras, and they basically are connected to a larger database. So Batman's able to see all of the individuals in the club and who they are. And what he ends up finding out is that in this underground nightclub, half of the people in there are cops. So half of the police force, or a lot of the highest ranking members, have been corrupted. They hang out with mobsters. Um, and I think, we've seen scenes like this before in movies. What makes this so good, especially for Batman, is typically Batman feels like this force, this law that's going into a situation. And when he's investigating, or when he's having someone investigate for him, criminals have nowhere left to run. They're about to be snagged. And Batman usually has, despite him being, a solo hero, he usually has this supporting cast of individuals who, are just as prominent as him in many ways. Alfred is usually depicted as this like very sophisticated, stoic old man. He usually has Commissioner Gordon, who's also depicted as, the leader of the police force. If Commissioner Gordon's helping Batman, then even if Batman doesn't solve the crime, they're not going to be able to stop him if he starts to. Batman feels like the law. In this situation, not only is this Batman like much more naive and young, but the only other person he has to rely on is Catwoman. And he just met Catwoman. This Catwoman isn't someone who is like easily impressed by Batman. She's not someone who's well trained. This is her first time. She's still really young. And she starts to like ignore him and kind of go rogue during the mission. And this is all just so cool because it really feels like Batman could fail at any moment. He doesn't have strong support. In this movie, Alfred is depicted as less of Batman's confidant and more of like his caretaker, because Bruce Wayne comes off so mentally ill that Alfred just basically looks over him, and he's using Batman as a way to help Bruce cope with the death of his parents. I've never seen Alfred depicted like that. He's an enabler because usually he doesn't see himself as an enabler because he believes what Batman's doing is right. Here it feels like he has to enable Batman or Bruce could get hurt by not being Batman. Same with Commissioner Gordon. Commissioner Gordon doesn't feel like this head of the police force that's helping Batman, kind of like he did in The Dark Knight. This Commissioner Gordon feels like someone who has very little control in the police force and is only depending on Batman because he literally has nowhere else to turn. And all of these characters, we can only rely on each other. They've been forced in a situation where they need to rely on each other. That's really cool. And it's why it's my favorite scene in the movie. So now here's my issues. Very early on, it's established that the police force is corrupt. Gotham PD has a lot of bad members in it, and they need to be stopped. And as the film goes on, we find out that they've actually been working with and for Falcone. It might be Falcone, I can't remember how to pronounce it, who's the head of the mob, basically the central mafia in Batman. And they've basically been letting him do whatever he wants as long as he provides them information, and also he could basically have anyone killed whenever he wants. My issue with this is that, and it's something I've always kind of had against films that involve a corrupt police force. We know historically that when the police are corrupted, it's usually by politicians or criminals who offer hush money and pull a few strings and corrupt just the right people in order to allow criminal enterprises to thrive. It's sort of similar to that McDonald's monopoly scheme, if you've ever heard of that, where just enough people in the McDonald's company and just the right people connected to McDonald's and just the right people connected to the mob. Okay, spoilers, but this is like a historical thing, are connected. But if one of those things, if just one element was found out or seen by a larger oversight group, the whole thing would crumble. And I can never get past that when I'm watching this film. They make a lot of wild claims, like Falcone's actually the mayor of the city, that there's no one on the police that they can trust. But this ends up being the truth by the end of the film, the police really aren't all corrupt. It's just specific members are corrupt. And if anything here sounds like I'm being vague or it doesn't really make a difference, I think the best version of this I've seen, especially in like a comic book show, is, and here's the Daredevil spoiler, in Daredevil season 3, we see how Kingpin corrupts the FBI. And he does this by finding, especially with one agent, he finds something personal he can use against the agent. And if he can just corrupt one agent, if he can just corrupt 5 agents, well, the FBI is the highest oversight force in the country. If they're willing to put over a blind eye, then who can stop them? Who can you turn to at that point? Then the criminal actually becomes a dictator. Anything less than that, a criminal corrupting beatnik cops, unfortunately, it's always going to have the side effect, or it's always going to come off like a threat that is less than the sum of its parts, or a threat that doesn't rise up to what it could be. I didn't know how Daredevil could beat the FBI. I did not know how he could do that. The answer usually is you need to show people the light of the day. People need to see. Or there needs to be one good person in this governing body who's willing to spread the word. I don't see that as being the best conflict for Batman. I know very clearly how Batman is going to beat corrupt cops and how he's going to beat Falcone. He is going to get enough good people on his side, because you have to assume Gotham is made up of good people. If I truly believed that all of the police force were corrupted, that would be another story. How does Batman enact law if the actual governing institutions or the law enforcement institutions don't exist, or exist in a very superficial way? That's a cool conflict, but it doesn't get there. But the end of this conflict is Falcone being brought out of getting arrested, him saying, "Don't you know I'm the leader of all the crime in the city?" And 1,000 cops being outside, or I'm the leader of all the cops in the city, and there's 1,000 cops outside, and they go, "Not all of them." And it's okay, well, what was he really the leader of then? So that didn't resonate with me. My second issue, and I feel like this is my bigger issue with the story. I have never been a fan of Batman stories where the Thomas Wayne is revealed to not have been a great guy, and Batman feels like his very origins are questioned. My issue with this is, if you look at the origin of Batman, he's a guy whose parents were killed outside of a movie theater, and from that day forward, he realized he needed to become a superhero to prevent stuff like that from happening again, even though it's essentially an eternal battle. There'll always be stuff like that, especially in seedy places like Gotham, and that's the greater conflict of Batman. Thomas Wayne turning out to be bad probably wouldn't stop Batman from being Batman. Batman saves criminals. I don't think that him finding out his father was a bad guy is going to stop him from being Batman. Now, what you could argue, and I think this is typically what they do with the Thomas Wayne conflict, is that if Thomas Wayne, the most simple, down-to-earth guy, or Thomas Wayne, the symbol of the everyday man, is bad, then are people worth fighting for? And I think that's kind of the deeper justification with the Thomas Wayne thing. Yes, and I think Batman thinks that. Part of what makes Batman such a, what makes Bruce Wayne and Batman so stoic and not as happy as Batman or not as whimsical as someone like Spider-Man or Superman, is that he realizes he might stop every criminal in the whole world, and the world is going to continue to create more criminals, that there's still like misery in it, that, you know, maintaining the status quo isn't the answer to all of the issues, isn't the answer to the human condition. Batman knows this. Even this naive Batman is aware of that. That's why he himself is not like a happy person. He knows that being vengeance isn't enough to make the world like a happier place. This is why he questions himself even at the beginning of the movie. He doesn't know if he's doing it, but he knows he needs to stop crime. So then the other argument that could be made is that Thomas Wayne was not only the everyday man, he was better. He was a martyr. He was someone that people wanted to aspire to be. My issue with this is I don't think that necessarily needs to be true. I find Thomas Wayne more interesting when that he was just a rich guy who probably did philanthropy, but he only did as much as like the average Bill Gates. He was probably a good guy, but he wasn't a like benevolent force. And he didn't depict himself that way. So when the film changes it to, yeah, that's what people thought of him, or that's what Bruce thought of him, I don't think it adds anything to Batman. It just makes Bruce seem a little bit more naive. Here's what, going back to my original point though, hypothetically, if you wanted to change the origin of Batman, you could. If I were to say to you, what's the origin of Icarus? You'd say, well, he's someone who made fake wings, flew too close to the sun, and died. The story of Icarus is he flew too close to the sun. The story of Batman is he saw his parents die and he became Batman. The difference being we don't know what happens to Batman. We don't know what ultimately kills him. We do know what ultimately kills Icarus. That final transformation is him getting too close to the sun and falling. You would never say that for Batman. There's no end to the Batman story. If you wanted to end the Batman story, you could say Batman saw his dad die. He did see his dad as a martyr, and he fought crime. Then one day he finds out his dad was involved in the crime, and that's what got him killed. And then that somehow causes a final transformation to Batman. Maybe he dies, maybe he becomes bad, maybe he gives up. Maybe he keeps going, but like lying to himself, something. That's the final phase of Batman. That doesn't exist. And that brings me to my biggest issue with this film and the ending. They introduced this huge change to Thomas Wayne, which, as I previously stated, I don't like as a story. I don't think it's actually an important part of Batman. But if you're going to insist that it is, you need to show that it changes Batman. Presumably, what Batman learns is that regardless of if his dad was actually a bad person, Gotham does not have any hope to lead it. Batman can be vengeance as long as he wants. There's no one who will guide Batman. There's no one that can guide Gotham in the dark. Gotham needs more. Gotham needs hope. It's kind of something that, clearly Dark Knight touched upon. So what does Batman do at the end of the movie? Well, the transformative moment is that he stops Riddler. Gotham's being flooded. He stops a bunch of bad guys who were shooting the citizens, and he guides them with a torch to safety, and then he medevacs them from the roof. Okay, if you were to turn on, here's kind of a challenge. If you turned on this Batman and you hadn't watched any of it, and you turn on the film and you saw Batman and he's standing on the roof and he sees people about to drown and he goes down and saves them with a torch, would that be surprising? Would that sequence surprise you? No, if not, if you expect Batman to act that way, then Batman as a character didn't fundamentally change through the film. Even though this Batman was depicted as being very nihilistic at the beginning, and only acting out on vengeance, I do not believe at any point this Batman wouldn't have saved people from drowning. He wouldn't have. Therefore, I don't think this conflict changed Batman. I think both the Thomas Wayne and the police force corruption story failed to elevate Batman. Now, compare this to Dark Knight. If you were to turn on Dark Knight and you hadn't seen anything, at the end of that film, when Batman tells Commissioner Gordon that the police need to chase him, that he's not the hero the city needs, is that something you'd think Batman would do? Batman asking Commissioner Gordon to make him a criminal seems to contradict who Batman is as a person. You wouldn't believe that Batman would do that. You'd have to watch Dark Knight to see the justification, to see how Joker proved that Batman needed to do that. And that's my biggest issue with the film. I don't think Batman changes as a character. And my biggest fear going forward is that this franchise will continue to only be superficial in how it addresses this character. But only time will tell. Anyways, what did you think? And have a great day. Bye.